Hi, I'm Lynn Richards, President and CEO of the National Congress for the New Urbanism.
And I'm Susan Henderson, Principal with Placemakers and a board member of CNU.
Zoning and codes represent the very DNA of your community. They dictate how tall buildings can be, where and how parking goes, and even where and how much landscaping is required. Yet, for many communities in the United States, their zoning codes are outdated. They don't reflect current conditions, and they don't reflect the community's vision for where and how they want to grow and develop. Updating outdated codes can be an incredibly complicated process, which is expensive and time-consuming. Today, we're going to talk to you about a code reform disruption that CNU has been pioneering that starts at the state level and then drills down into the biggest little thing that cities can do to dramatically enable better places. In today's course, we'll be discussing what walkable urbanism is and what are the barriers to achieving it. What is incremental code reform and what is the methodology behind it to ensure context-sensitive solutions?
We'll also be looking at the range of contexts in which the code reform occurs. This is structured on place types within the rural, the urban, and the suburban contexts. And then we'll give you a series of solutions for the context that you can implement at home. So the biggest takeaway from this course for you is that you will strategically be able to choose what you think you can get done in your city.
After today's course, you'll be able to assess whether or not incremental code reform is right for you, what are the initial steps to start, and then specifically what you can do to your codes and ordinances to start the process. So let's get started. CNU's mission is to champion walkable urbanism. In this chapter, we'll describe what walkable urbanism is and what the components are. I often get asked, what is walkable urbanism? The short answer is that it's a place that is compact, mixed use, with a range of choices on where and how to shop, work, play, and get around. And it's a place where people and businesses can thrive and prosper. It's sustainable and it's healthy. But it's actually more than that. When we talk about walkable urbanism, we have to keep in mind the public realm, the space between the buildings, because that's where the magic happens. That's where we are able to use design of the community, design of the neighborhood, design of the street to enable people to come together and to gather. And that's really what we're talking about. At the end of the day, it's that dynamic between the built environment and the social component which exist in these places that enable us to create socially just neighborhoods that are environmentally resilient, economically prosperous, and are people-centered places. That is walkable urbanism. In this chapter, we'll discuss the wide range of barriers that prevent more walkable urbanism from being built. Where and how communities are designed, planned, and built are very much a local issue. Yet many people don't recognize or don't realize how the federal government creates unintentional barriers. For example, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Housing Urban Development Agency all have requirements around water infrastructure that promote and finance low-density development. Additionally, where and how many of the developments are financed are dictated by rules governed by HUD, even if you're not using federal funding. Additionally, federal funding rules play an enormous role in determining which product types can be built and financed. If a loan does not meet the requirements under HUD funding, even if you're not using any HUD funding, it can't be sold on the secondary market. This financing barrier has been an enormous barrier for many communities trying to create more walkable communities. Demand for walkable urbanism has never been higher, but that demand is not spread out evenly. In market preference surveys over the last 25 years on both sides of the aisle consistently say that about 50% of the population wants a more compact, walkable urbanism neighborhoods, yet the other 50% are demanding more of the suburban development, low-density suburban development type. In good development processes, Residents and stakeholders are included in the very beginning of the conversation. And in not so good development processes, they're included at the end to submit comment. In both of these cases, the issue of fear of the unknown, the fear of what next can rise to the top, and the issue around and the dynamic around not in my backyard becomes a dominating force, stopping or delaying many development problems. The public, first off, will say, what are we going to do with traffic? Because walkable urbanism requires higher density than what you have in suburban conditions. So inevitably, concerns are raised about where are we going to put the cars? Where's the traffic going to go? We have shifted our priorities from designing cities for people to designing where and how cars can move. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, dear God, I want to sit in traffic today. People get up in the morning and they think, where and how can I go about my day in the most enjoyable mechanism possible? We need to shift our perspective away from where are we going to put the car infrastructure and to think, how am I going to live my life today? A big part of why we can't get more walkable urbanism is absolutely the local land use regulations, such as parking. Significant barriers come up on that as local ordinances set where and how much parking you can have. Where's it going to be? How many cars are going to be parked? And what are we going to do about the day after Thanksgiving? I challenge all of you to go out the day after Thanksgiving and to take photographs of the empty parking lots. Stormwater requirements are another incredible barrier for walkable urbanism. Many cities and towns have stormwater requirements that are better suited for a suburban condition. Take, for an example, a city in Tennessee that requires that for all development, including redevelopment, you have a stormwater pond. Imagine you're downtown with a stormwater pond. Better would be to look at what are the street level solutions that can better manage your stormwater and really enhance the pedestrian and walkable environment of your city or town. Street design standards are another way that walkable urbanism is prevented. Many cities and towns take their standards from state documents which require wider lane widths. Wider lane widths mean that cars go faster. The faster cars go, the more dangerous it is for pedestrians. Is that really what we want from our walkable places? Areas of danger for our grandparents, for our parents, for our children? Finally, zoning codes, as we discussed, haven't been updated in decades. Zoning was intended to protect residents. It made no sense to put residential next to an industrial plant, and that made a lot of sense. However, there are now loads of unintentional consequences, such as we discussed, unupdated zoning codes that are decades out of date. Today's zoning codes have to reflect the current priorities and the current conditions faced by many cities and towns today. And that's what we'll be discussing in the next chapter. What is and how to achieve incremental code reform. In this chapter, we'll introduce you to the Project for Code Reform and how incremental code reform efforts differ from traditional code reform efforts. I started thinking about this issue because there are 42,000 units of local government in the United States. And how is it that with all of the national documents that have been created by EPA, essential code fixes for rural, suburban, and urban places, the American Planning Association smart codes, the C&U smart code, national organizations have been developing code fixes to address this problem of the 42,000 units of local government for the last 2 decades, and yet we're barely making a dent. As of June 2019, only 728 form-based codes have been developed. Now, form-based code is just one type of code, so let's take that number and triple it. Just for kicks and giggles, we're going to triple it. So now there's 2,100 codes that have been changed out of 42,000? If codes are so important, if they're the very DNA of the community, and it's so important to update them for current conditions, to reflect the priorities, to enable cities and towns to rebuild after disasters, why is it so hard to change them? As we've discussed, it's incredibly expensive, time-consuming, complicated, requires public buy-in, and the public default answer these days is no. Incredible political savviness to navigate the process. So can we do it differently? And I wanted to go through that background so you could see where my mindset is. There's 42,000 units of local government. Nobody has a good handle on how many codes have been changed, but let's just kicks and giggles 3,000. That's about another 40,000 codes that still have to be updated. What happens if we took that problem and just shifted it a little bit? Instead of seeking to change the codes, working directly with 42,000 units of local government, or in this case, about 40,000, what about working with the states? What happens if we started thinking about what's the most important piece that needs to change? So instead of guaranteeing a great place, we're enabling a better place. And this idea came from Rick Bernhardt, who was the planning director of the city of Nashville. He started working there about 25 years ago. He's now retired. And he was like, I'm going to fix Nashville, and I'm going to do it one code at a time. And he started, and was like, you know what, new development, we're just going to require that the parking goes in the back. Nice and simple, one change. It was this idea that if you do nothing else, do this. And that's what really started this idea of incrementally reforming your code. We think about it in this arc of engagement. Instead of going all the way over a wholesale code reform where it requires incredible amount of time, a lot of political will, public buy-in as inexpensive, what happens if you just do one aspect of your code? That worked, that wasn't so painful? Do the next one. What are those components of the code that are so important and critical to enable a good place? And that's the other piece, this idea of enabling or guaranteeing. And so much about incremental code reform is about enabling a good place and not guaranteeing a good place. Additionally, the Project for Code Reform focuses at the state level. If we're going to be thinking about how to meet the needs of those 42,000 units of local government, we have to start at the state level. And it makes a lot of sense that the coding conditions in Michigan is going to be very different from the coding conditions in New Mexico or in Arizona or in Maine. So if we can start looking at what are the most important code issues at the state level, and then within that state level, what are those aspects? If you do nothing else, do this. We find that the audience for incremental code reform is not only planning directors and council members and planning staff, but it's also community members. AARP has been a strong partner with us and really engaging and enabling their membership. State agencies are incredibly supportive and want to do more, as well as NGOs such as the state-based American Planning Association, the state-based American Institute for Architects, as well as trade associations such as the National Association of Realtors. We're finding that anybody who's engaged, any stakeholder that is engaged in where and how a community is designed, planned, and built is really interested in how we can more easily and efficiently update our local codes and ordinances to better reflect the needs of the city and the town and the neighborhoods in which we live. It's an incredibly important idea around do the biggest little thing that's going to transform or is going to enable better development in your city. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what the methodology is working at the state level to ensure that we'll get context-sensitive solutions.
This very short chapter is a brief overview of the areas of reform that we will discuss in the following chapter. And I want to begin by saying that the list that we will talk about today is for the urban context, the solutions for main streets and downtowns and adjacent neighborhoods. We have a whole separate set of areas of reform for different contexts, like, for example, the suburban context. And recently with our work in Vermont, we have an entire separate set that we utilize for affordable housing solutions. So this will be different at each state level or for each particular problem that you face. In this case, we're talking about the biggest little thing, like Lynn mentioned, is they're just the simple solutions that achieve the greatest impact in each of these categories, and throwing all the darts at the board and coming to agreement on what the biggest problems were in those various contexts. This is what came forth. We're dealing with streetscape, and one of the biggest issues here is finding the solutions that are context-based. And so often in conventional suburban development these days, it's a one-size-fits-all for the entire jurisdiction. So the streetscape solutions are very context-sensitive. Dealing with form, and this is like the bread and butter of most zoning codes. It's heights and setbacks and lot coverage and densities. And then use, and being able to open that up to mixed use in most cases where it's a compatible use, or broadening the definition of use. Frontages, and this is one thing that most zoning codes don't address at all, but it's the thing that makes all the difference. Like Lynn was talking earlier about building community and the public realm and considering the space between the buildings. The one thing that private development contributes the most to a person's perception of a city or of a town as they pass through it is what happens at the front of the building. And so often codes ignore that altogether. So we talk about that, and then finally parking, and as we've both discussed in great detail, it's where it goes and how much it is. So in all of this work that we do, we are focusing on vibrancy and pedestrian activity. If you're picking your biggest little thing wherever you are living and working, make sure that the goal is the experience of the pedestrian. I love this image. It is in New Orleans, and as you probably know, it's one of the cities in the United States where the pedestrian rules. And I actually feel sorry for the motorist in this city, because the pedestrian is so comfortable that they take over the entire public realm, and that's our goal.
In this chapter, we're going to discuss the impact that incremental code reform has had already. I started this effort in 2016 with just an idea that we needed to meet local governments where they are. So if you think about it, we haven't been doing this very long, and yet already it has transformed how the 505 Michigan communities are looking at how to do development better. And in Vermont, it has taken the state by storm. As Chris Cochran says, we're not talking about radically changing any community, but what are the few things that we can do now that will make a difference and will make more affordable housing choices available in Vermont? That's what we're talking about, incrementally changing what is happening at the local level by working with our state partners. A great example of this already is the city of Kalamazoo, which is in Michigan. We finished the statewide document, they had that available, and it came out just at the same time that they were finishing their new master plan. They asked themselves, what can we do now to enable better development to happen and to stop letting bad development keep happening? And this is in the interim period while they were doing a wholesale city. They had a new master plan, needed to do a whole city code reform effort, but they wanted to start looking now at how they could start incrementally improving their code. A new code was adopted in 2018, just 1 year after, and it was just for a neighborhood. And again, how can we enable better development? And they're using it now as a case study to how to incrementally replace all of the codes in their city. Incremental code reform is a different way for communities to address the challenges that they are facing. If you're grappling with how to increase mobility, absolutely we should be investing in light rail and in broader transit. But at the same time, what can we do at the city level? What can we do at the neighborhood level? What can we do at the street level that will encourage and enable more walking, more social gathering? Absolutely, when we're grappling with issues around affordable housing, we need federal involvement for Hope 6 or the Choice Neighborhoods or whatever program comes next. But at the same time, we can enable more affordable housing choices by making granny flats and accessory dwelling units legal. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And while the public engagement process is so important and completely needs to be overhauled, while we still need public meetings, how can we begin to break it down and to bring people back into the conversation about where and how their communities, their streets, their neighborhoods are designed, planned, and built? As I said, incremental code reform is a different way to look at the challenges that communities are facing, and it's a way we believe that will disrupt coding practices across the country. Are you interested in participating? There's still many more states that we need to address. We've done 2 out of the next 50. In addition, there are a number of areas that we still need to address: transportation, street design, stormwater management, subdivision regulations. We work at the state level, but we also work directly with communities through our training and education. Contact us through the website or our email if you're interested in us coming to your state or participate in one of our state level trainings. Thank you very much.